Welcome to another episode of the VX Insight podcast series. This episode, we're going to be looking at the case for tokenization in securities finance. A few weeks ago, we put out a new fact sheet entitled The Numbers Behind Tokenization, supported by digital asset. And the intent of that fact sheet was really to drill into the facts and figures that support the case for tokenization in securities financing, sec lending, repos, and collateral, and to evidence the huge amounts of progress that are being made in that space today. Now, this conversation is really aimed at digging into the facts, figures, and details behind that narrative, and it's brilliant to be able to leverage the support of Kelly Mathieson from Digital Asset and Ken DeGiglio from Equilend, who have done huge amounts of work and preparation in driving forwards the case for tokenization and DLT in sec lending. If you'd like more information on the fact sheet, please visit thevalueexchange.co and off with the conversation. So, Kelly, Ken, it's fantastic to have you here today to be able to walk through all of the challenges and the solutions that are emerging in terms of applying digital technologies to the securities finance space. So really what we're going to walk through in the next half hour, 45 minutes is just a quick recap in terms of the problem statement across sec lending. Ken, your expert area of specialism, and across the overall securities financing space, including collateral, which Kelly, you may have worked in once or twice in the past. So it's brilliant. And thank you very, very much, both of you, for joining this.
Thank you.
Kelly, can we kick off by just a quick overview statement in terms of basically, securities finance is obviously getting an awful lot of attention in terms of transformation at the moment. There's huge amounts of aspirations, both on the sec lending space and on the repos side, to be able to really do some cool stuff. Why is this getting so much attention? What's the starting point that basically is drawing everyone to this industry over and above others?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question, because I think for those that may not be as active in the industry as Ken and his team, or as I had the pleasure of being, the securities lending and the repo industry is a way for market liquidity to be created. It is a way for the sell side to finance their balance sheets, to have capital balance in what they do. And in fact, it supports the ability to make markets and do broker-dealer activities, for anything on the buy side, from broker-dealers to hedge funds and the like. But equally, it's an opportunity for those market participants that are naturally long unencumbered securities to have cash, to have the opportunity to earn incremental yield, either lending them out or participating in a repo transaction. So it's one of those market transactions that's dual-sided, where both sides get the opportunity to meet a very unique business need that has the additional benefit of creating market liquidity and the deep and rich markets that we look for across various security types.
And I mean, Ken, how do you see it from a sec lending perspective, in terms of our starting point? Obviously, lots and lots of desire for change. What do you feel our starting point is on this one?
Yeah, so, I grew up always on technology side, but I've grown up sort of more on the cash equity side of the business and the wealth management, retail brokerage side of the business. And I always like to tell people that I think both of those domains are about, I'll say, decades ahead of where the sec lending space is specifically. I mean, we've done a lot of work from the Equilend side on post trade over the last 20 years, but the last big real transformation was the launch of what is now NGT, was Auto Borrow 20 years ago. And so, people have been throwing incremental resources and incremental dollars at fixing it, but I think that's not going to work anymore, right? Settlement cycles are just getting shorter, budgets are getting more and more constrained, and volumes are just going up. You started with sort of the securities financing in general. The lines are blurring between what was always very siloed securities lending versus repo versus synthetics. And as those lines blur and all the other market forces happen, the incremental change is really almost at this point throwing good money after bad. And I think, it's got to be something that's really transformational change from this juncture on.
Yeah. That's a great starting point. So the end of incremental and this idea that we're starting to throw good money after bad. I mean, that positions everything we're going to talk about really well. So looking at the sec lending space, I mean, you've obviously, with Equilend and with your kind of all of your clients and members, you've had a fantastic ability to build the story right from the base upwards, from the ground upwards. So can we maybe just walk through ultimately, first of all, what the kind of the operational hotspots are in terms of what could be fixed, where the real problems are, and ultimately how you've arrived at a kind of a lifting off point with OneSource?
Yep. I guess like Kelly did at the beginning, just a little background about how sort of the current workflows operate. So there's a lot of bilateral and multilateral stuff that happens. But unfortunately for our industry, everybody ends up storing the current state of the contract in their own proprietary systems in a very siloed way. And we're dealing with contracts that sometimes have a very long tenure in life and duration. And over that duration, there's a lot of events that happen. Market prices change, rates change, allocations change, people do returns, people do recalls. And what you end up with is a whole bunch of people then trying to clean up the reconciliation breaks on the back end. And, we at Equilend, since the beginning of the NGT days, have seen significantly less breaks at the beginning of a contract for trades that were executed on a venue like NGT than we do on trades that were done over the phone or fax or however else they do these things. So really what we're trying to do with OneSource is create a single source of truth and essentially do for the post-trade lifecycle events what NGT and Autoborrow did for the industry 20 years ago on the trading side. And that's how we think about it internally. So that really means you gotta sort of change the paradigm. You've got to get consensus from both parties up front. You've got a single story and a single source of truth. You got to give people common reference data. And then probably most importantly, and is sort of how we got to things like DAML and Canton, is you've got to be able to mutualize those workflows. And we just think that the DLT fabric brings us the single source of truth, and the smart contracts brings us a way to mutualize those multi-party workflows. So, I mean, that's, and Equilend didn't get there themselves. We got there with the working group, who I think we talked about this before, we're 10 of the biggest borrowers and lenders out there in the street.
Yeah. And just one quick question on that, because, if for me, one of the most important things is ultimately the journey that of kind of distilling down, because ultimately where you've got to is a priority call that's, there are many things that you could fix across the overall. I was just curious to see how did you end up prioritizing as you said, the data and the reconciliation layer over and above transactional elements and other things that, that other technologies could bring?
Yep. So I guess just giving a little bit of background, we kicked this thing off, I guess it was late 2022. Late 2021. The working group agreed that it could not be a DLT working group. We wanted it to be a digital transformation working group. We wanted to find a problem and a use case. And if we thought DLT was the right solution to apply to that problem and use case, then that was gravy. So what we did is we actually had a survey where we asked people in a blind way to vote on what they thought the biggest problem areas were, and they voted them ranked 1 through 5. And eliminating post-trade reconciliation became the leader in the clubhouse very quickly and by a long margin. Some of the other use cases that were out there was an ALD use case. There was actually a tokenization use case itself. And where we got to was, if you can actually solve the first problem and get a single source of truth and eliminate reconciliation problem, some of the other things like ALD and tokenization, corporate actions was one of them. We'll just sort of follow on to that, but you had to lay this foundation of eliminate breaks and the need for post-trade reconciliation.
Get the basics right. Yeah. No, look, I think that for me, that's so, I think, there's so many great examples of innovation, and I think for me, this really stands out as one in terms of really, as you said, the biggest banks in the world actually, very transparently actually coming to this decision as a collective, I think is such a great way of doing it. And ultimately, probably one of the biggest drivers that, Kelly, we've talked about many times before. And I mean, on the repo side, and including the collateral side that supports all of this, how do you see things, Kelly, from a kind of current state perspective? Because again, data reconciliation, all these issues flow over very neatly, I guess, into the collateral space. Do you see the same problems arising?
It's very similar. In fact, if I can make one point before I more directly answer your question, just to pick up on something Ken said, the reality is for as long as we all have been in this industry, there have been other attempts to have, I'm going to use a different word, have a more mutualized approach to be able to have processing and shared workflows. The challenge is that up until now, or up until recently with these newer technologies, and specifically the smart contracts and DLT that Ken refers to, we would always enter into these industry conversations. They had cool names that we would use to think about the projects, and we were going to, solve world hunger by getting a mutualized agreement on how we were going to operate, really this sort of main vein of financial services, right? Someone had once described this area of financial services as being, it's not even just the food, it's the oxygen. And so if you can't do this well, you really sort of cease to operate. And certainly we saw that in 2008 and some subsequent market conditions. But in any event, but they always just stopped short, because what we would do is we would get to the point where one of us had to elect to be the one who would hold all the data, or the rest of us had to agree. And that's where the conversation would die, because as much as we all liked each other, we were in point of fact competitors. And I think what's really quite innovative in its approach, as well as its design, that Ken and the team at Equilend are doing, is they are bringing that group together of 10 of the largest, who are still competitors, and they are going to be at the end of it. There's no mutualized act. They're going to use the new OneSource platform to be better than each other. So, but anyway, to answer your question, I think the parallel in collateral management is, and I realized 2008 was 15 years ago at this point. Sometimes it feels like we're still yesterday, but quite some time. But I think in the years since then, a couple of things have happened. One is that, and some of it was regulatory driven, some of it was otherwise. One is that collateral, more types of transactions require collateral. The amount of collateral being required was greater. And the type of collateral being required was more prescriptive, and thus was born the HQLA term of having high quality liquid collateral. I'll add also too, I think what also occurred during those years, or the subsequent years since then, is you also have to be in a transaction where you can actually take delivery of that collateral if something goes wrong. And so you sort of fast forward now to 15 years later, where arguably it's almost a generation. People are sort of forgetting what the pain of that weekend and the year leading up to it, or 2 years leading up to it, felt like. And more types of transactions that are ever increasing in their complexity, in the bespoke nature, whether it's for the pursuit of yield or a hedging purpose. And the fact is that it's exactly aligned to Ken's point. The systems that were built to support these transactions, most of them were created in the 80s and the early 90s when repo was invented. The 80s and the early 90s. There is no more adding on to them or adding adjacent to them. We're at that moment where you have to do sort of a level reset for the next set of decades to be able to support the types of volume, activity, complexity, and prescription of collateral that's required for transactions that give return, like securities lending and collateral management, or collateralized mortgage obligations, or margin management on derivatives. It's all having the same effect. And the fact of the matter is that the technologies and the systems that were created prior to this have reached the end of their useful life.
Yeah. But do you think also, though, that for me, one of the reasons why sec lending and repos and collateral are all great opportunities for this, as Ken says as well, is to say there are systems is probably an overstatement. Ultimately, this is probably one of the most kind of like, or at least STP kind of worlds in terms of highly fragmented systems, lots and lots of use of phone calls, emails and stuff. So as you said, it's people, process and platforms from the 80s, not just the kind of the technology in from what I can tell.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the secrets of the industry that we're in, and it's quite ironic when you consider that the very existence of collateral is to reduce or at least allow you to intentionally mitigate the risk associated with a transaction. And the very systems, but also the processes. And maybe your point is that it's not just simply the technology, but the processes that are set up to handle that are largely manual. I mean, it's sort of a secret in the industry, but still a great degree, a higher proportion than people would think of eligibility schedules are processed manually. And if you think about that, that's the injection of risk into something that the entire purpose of it existing is to remove risk. So I just think, you just use the word useful life. I think we've sort of reached the end of this particular arc of having the advent of collateral transaction types, understanding what they can provide in terms of yield and return and building the processes around them. Now we need to go through a wave of fine-tuning and improving those processes themselves. And that's going to require not just simply rewrite the same code in a new distributed and network-like language. It's going to mean reimagining those processes themselves. And it's interesting because now you come back to mutualization, but it's mutualization in a different term where I can preserve my competition with all of the other market participants and at the same time gain the benefits of having a shared data model, which is what Ken referred to earlier.
Yeah, I love the reimagine expression because that's exactly what we're doing. Everything Kelly just said, everybody knows, we don't believe, everybody knows there's a lot of collateral locked up on the sidelines that really should be put to work, but there's so much friction in the current ecosystems that you can't put it to work at the right velocity.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, and one of the questions that for me that, as you said, we've been here sometimes before in terms of kind of, yes, there are, as you said, there are older technologies that have presented themselves and things, but one of the biggest problems has always been the kind of, okay, what's it worth to fix it, in terms of the ins and outs. And so just briefly, just to think about on the sec lending side, I mean, obviously you've done a lot of work quantifying this, but what is it worth for us to actually fix this stuff? I mean, incremental change has always been based on some kind of P&L, but it feels like now that P&L estimation is vastly different.
Yeah. So one of the things that the working group did early on, so I guess it was last spring, is we did what we call the industry-wide business case in collaboration with the working group, Equilend, and a third-party consulting firm. And we published that back out to the working group, and that posited that there could be $100 million plus in annual run rate saves across the entire sec lending industry. Now, people can argue with the exact number, but the thing that people don't argue with is that it is extremely, extremely significant. I'm not sure if you recently saw there was a ICMA in collaboration, I think, with Boston Consulting Group white paper that was published recently. And that was just, what do we think the impact of DLT could be on the broader capital markets industry? And they were throwing around numbers in the tens of billions, if you remember. So actually I had an internal conversation with some of the folks here. And I was like, we shouldn't be so shy about throwing around the $100 million plus number. And, it's not equally spread, but the business case said that comes some out of operational saves and some potential headcount save in operations, some out of technology infrastructure saves, and some out of just P&L and more revenue opportunity on the velocity scale side.
Yeah. And for me, I'm really glad you mentioned those three categories at the end there, because I think for me, what's so key is that it's not just an operational play, nor is it just we're going to whack in a new system and a new platform and ultimately it's going to solve all of our problems. There's a strong workflow element, but also, as you said, that third piece of optimization is it's the kind of the gift that keeps on giving in a way.
Yep.
and for me, Kelly, in the collateral space, especially in the repos as well, that third piece for me feels like the real kicker in terms of why it's worth our getting involved in the collateral space and the repo space at all. No.
It's interesting that you say that. I couldn't possibly agree more. I mean, for so many years, when in my prior role, getting to lead collateral management at JP Morgan, if I'm allowed to say that, it was the holy grail for us, was to be able to get to that optimization that Ken refers to, because the consequence of leaving collateral around the globe in an over-collateralized way is the loss of yield or the loss of use. And being under-collateralized or under-margined or under-collateralized was just awful, right? In fact, created often fiduciary responsibilities for some of the securities lending agents that were using these systems. So it was this constant battle of trying to make sure that you weren't being overly wasteful, but at the same time, you couldn't run the risk that the right collateral wasn't in the right place. Not even at the right time, before the right time. And so that just leads to parking a lot of U.S. Treasuries around the globe, which is not particularly efficient for a market that is required and is rewarded for running on efficiency. I think what becomes different as a result of this, to your point, is optimization can get enhanced in a couple of ways. One is that same operating process that we've been talking about becomes much more real time, far more transparent. And I mean transparent through the chain, not just at a moment in time, but through the chain of activities, so that you can know with greater certainty what's coming in, with greater certainty on what you can rehypothecate, whether you can't reuse it, where you can reuse it. And you can have more in the moment total perspective on the usefulness of the collateral that you have, where it can go, and how quickly it can get there. But importantly, or implied in what I'm saying, is a much more advanced settlement model. And I know that sounds hugely boring when optimization is such a better term, but the reality is that settlement is what's holding back optimization right now. And sort of the inability of knowing what you have and how fast you can move it, and having collateral confidence factors and settlement risk, and which cutoff times, and is the cutoff to a local custodian instead of a global custodian. So there it's 4 hours earlier, right? I mean, all of this just adds up to far less transactions being done than could be. So I said there are 2 points. That first point is about improving the process with a much more transparent and efficient settlement model. I'll park the second thought so that I don't go on, but you really can begin to get into now much more mathematically complex multi-factor optimizations that allow for a much more bespoke approach to not just simply let's move more collateral around, but how can I be quite prescriptive in a good way of projecting and foreseeing where collateral should go, and the best combinations that allow for you not only to minimize the move, but maximize the effectiveness of collateral against an obligation. And frankly, other than a few valiant attempts at the organization I used to be part of, it doesn't really exist in great number around the globe.
Yeah, and I think that for me, to pull what we've said together so far, what's great is that ultimately the $100 million number is very much, as we said, it's from the ground up. It's very much okay. Here and now, there are operational process savings and utilization savings that we can put our hands on and say, right, okay, we can see this coming. And then you've got the second phase, which, one of the people complain about DLT and all this is that it's all dreamware and it's all kind of like, it's all over there. But I think for me, this 2 steps, of right, there's very much here and now, and there's all the things that it unlocks. It really helps, I think, to contextualize the benefits of why we should even get started on this.
I think what Equilend is doing opens the opportunity, not for right now, but as these guys get that platform up and going, opens the opportunity for some conversations and, state of affairs we have in securities lending, repo, and collateral right now, like agent lender indemnification. Well, if you can act, which really drains what a securities lending agent earns on a transaction. In fact, you could argue it's quite out of balance between what the sell side earns on a transaction and the buy side. So I really don't want this podcast to be Kelly Mathieson said we should get rid of indemnification, but I do kind of feel like there's an opportunity to talk about some of those things for the first time ever, because if you now have settlement, transparency, and certainty, and you can actually see and lock that asset and know that that asset is going to come back to the buyer or something that the buyer has approved to be very acceptable as a substitute, then do you really need to indemnify for the existence of the borrower? Because you've now created much more certainty around the collateral itself. So we're not there yet, but I would welcome the opportunity.
But in terms of steps in the chain, and similarly,
it becomes possible to talk about it for the first time ever.
With
what Equilend's doing.
Yeah. And equally, I suppose, when if you look at what DLR's been doing, in terms of actually the ALM desk, the ability, as you said, when you come back to this idea of settlement drives utilization, for me, that it's so great because it's the yawn word that drives the funky word, kind of, as opposed to the other way around. And it's, for me, if you look at, as I said, if you look at the intraday repo, the mere existence of that from an ALM desk, it can completely rip the heart out of basically the way people are actually funding themselves today. And as you said, it starts to present opportunities that just don't even exist today. So it seems to be worthwhile having a look at this. We've talked about basically we're at the end of the arc in terms of what's got us here. We think there's about $100 million plus in the early stages of the benefits of this. So what is it? What's the solution look like in terms of, maybe if you can give us the kind of blueprint of what the target operating model looks like from an industry angle?
Yeah. So one of the other things that the working group was very considerate of is what is the phasing and rollout strategy on this type of transformation. And we've seen, unfortunately, in recent times, some pretty big projects that are trying to implement things on DLT or blockchain not go the happy path. So we were very diligent and I think very modest in our phasing and our approach. So, we finished the business case last spring. We went through a very, very thorough design study, which included scoping some of the high-level requirements and actually the RFP process that got us to the selection of Damon and Canton. And then we dove sort of deep into MVP build at the beginning of this year. We're very excited. This month, just turned into July, we're doing a pilot with 5 clients around contract initiation. So we will actually initiate contract for the first time on the DLT and one source in our pre-production environment. And then we think the MVP launch will be, call it sometime a year from now, 12 months from now. I think the biggest hurdle we've had to get over is sort of the clients mobilizing around their internal build and their internal integration and their prioritizing their internal transformation. And we're starting to get real creative about how to help them get through that. And so MVP launch will be very, very focused on sort of North American equities, replace that with clear to DTC with cash collateral. And then we'll go region by region, collateral type by collateral type, asset type by asset type, and expand sort of the scope. And then what we call the art of the possible, once that foundational single source of truth is laid across all those asset types, all the regions, and all the collateral types, then you can start thinking about really cool stuff like how do you solve the corporate action problem on top of that new infrastructure.
Yeah. So essentially, basically, the contracts will be initiated on the blockchain, obviously, therefore shared in real time by the 5 pilot participants, for example, and ultimately that will feed into all of the disparate systems that are today basically having to reconcile against each other, and therefore eliminating all of the frictional pieces around that. Yeah. So, a quick question on that, and I remember really clearly when we last chatted, you said that your point to the whole group was, look, it's not going to be a comfortable ride. We're going to have to change some stuff along the way. Back to what we were saying before about people, process, and platform. How are you finding readiness to adapt all three? That not to see this as just a technical plug and play, but actually to see people really ready to optimize the way they run their systems and all this kind of thing.
So I don't think you can do this transformational change without buy-in. And if you need buy-in, you need buy-in from all the stakeholders. So we were very sure at the beginning of the working group to make sure that we had stakeholders from each of the clients, from technology, from operations, and from the business or the desk, but the front office. And that's worked really well for us. Anytime we get too much talking about technology, and Equilend sort of gravitates there, it's the working group that keeps us on and say, hold on a second, guys, this is less about the API. That's going to work. We're confident you can build that correctly and we can code to it. It's more about our internal workflows and changing the way we all do business and getting comfortable with paradigm shifts where there can be a single source of variance on a benchmark rate. And when the benchmark rate changes, we can re-rate all the contracts across the board on top of the single source of truth in one source. So they definitely get the joke that it's about workflows. It's about changing the operational procedures, or else we're just throwing new technology at some of the same problems. So sort of re-engineer first and then sort of apply the technology second has been a mantra from the beginning on this thing.
Yeah. And I mean, Kelly, you seeing a similar amount of kind of a similar journey play out on the collateral space? Obviously, you guys are involved in many projects in that world. I mean, how do you find the trajectory looking on that side of the fence, if that makes sense?
I'd say it's sort of following the same process, and that's whether we're talking about collateral that's being provided against cash in a repo transaction, or the securities collateral that's being provided in securities lending transactions, or just collateral that's being provided for very initial and variation margin. It's this first step tends to be focused on the creation of the platform and the ability for there to be confidence in knowing that a GMRA, GMSLA, or ISDA, or a CSA, just to follow the same transactions, can be accurately represented in the technology, can be relied on from relied on from an auditing and a tracking perspective. But then what we start to see, so it is about sort of that same step, but I suspect what Ken will begin to experience, which is a nice problem to have in terms of the activity, is, and now what can I do with it? Once you sort of get that in place and you have the confidence, we see this in other projects. You kindly mentioned Broadridge DLR earlier, but we see this in that once someone comes on, it begins to open up the possibilities of, now I'm in an operating environment where I have greater certainty around settlement. I have operational, fluidity might be the better way to say it, across multiple parties and participants. And I'm beginning to experience, you and I've talked about this before, you begin to experience the environment where you're relying, or where you're focused on counterparty risk and credit risk and market risk, and the settlement risk is sort of not there anymore. Yeah. And that begins to open up the ideas of what greater volume can be done. I think, we have a tendency, and I think, Barney, you found this in some of your studies before, to say, of all the securities, 20 to 25 trillion or so that are in demand for some form of collateralized transactions, only about 10% of them are out on loan in securities lending or in use. So it's, the demand is there. We just need the operating processes and the systems to catch up. And that's what we start to see now.
Yeah. But it does,
or focus on that, I should say.
Well, but I think, there are great examples, of things coming through. We're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars of turnover coming through on some of these platforms. This is all becoming real now. That, whereas, 5-10 years ago, somebody would have looked at this space and say, I just can't see any point other than just incremental investments. But ultimately now there are enough, beginnings of narratives to say, well, actually, this has got legs and it's got volumes.
And this thing is through. I'm sorry, go ahead, Kelly.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, this thing is clearly through the hype cycle. And I think for the last, call it 5 or 10 years, there's been a bunch of science experiments going on, but this is some real live use cases, practical use cases happening now. The first time I went to one of the digital asset hosted client advisory groups, and every major market infrastructure player was in the room and all the major banks were in the room. And I started to just listen to the use cases that people are applying this technology to. I came back and, Christopher was probably there, where I said to my boss, I was like, listen, the train has left the station, the horse is out of the barn, pick whatever cliche you want, but we've got to be playing this game, and everybody else has got to get on board, or else they're going to be left behind.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, a really great point. I mean, all of the research that we've done points to the fact that actually, of all of these areas, tech finance is now the kind of leading area of focus, I think, for this kind of innovation. So I think it's not just that everyone's working on it, but ultimately, this is probably the most ready, market ready in terms of opportunities.
Well, before I got to Equilend, I used to look at DLT, and particularly blockchain, less DLT, and say it's a solution looking for a problem. Yeah. When I got to Equilend, I sort of said the same thing, but I ended that sentence with, but if it's going to find a problem, it's likely to find it in our domain. And guess what? It did.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great. So just one last question, if I may. So, why is this all not going to come together? There's so many great pieces that we've touched on in terms of why this is different from before. I think, for me, the whole stakeholder engagement, the whole piece of getting the 10 banks around the table early on, getting them to do the driving, I think is a noticeable kind of point of difference from other projects in the past. But what are the other areas where we feel that basically it's different this time, ultimately, in terms of the challenges that we're facing, but also answers that we're bringing to the table? I don't know, Kelly, if you've got a view from a wider perspective.
Yeah, I think being early in the industry on this, we have the pleasure of having many lessons learned as we go through this. The only thing that I would add that to the points, I mean, there are many things we could add, but another key thing to add is to focus on these incremental builds, right? None of these are sort of rip and replaces. That's not what Ken and his team are doing, who frankly, thoughtfully took the time to learn the technology even before they got to building it functionally, right? So you begin to know what you can actually build and accomplish with these more compound solutions, these network solutions, as we call them. So those are the two things I'd mentioned. One, we see this with Deutsche Börse, incrementally building adjacent to your existing technology systems, so that you can gradually begin to migrate technology and functionality and operating flows, allowing your market to learn it, allowing you and your operating team to learn it, allowing regulators to be comfortable with it. So that's it. I think the other key point too is it goes back a little bit to what Ken was saying about the hype has gone, really focusing, frankly, and this is the person representing the technology organization saying this, but focus less on that and go back to focusing on the business case. What revenue has been trying to gain, or what new clients, what risk are we trying to reduce? I mean, for all of financial services, the projects that are most successful, especially those that are cross-industry and that have some network or multi-party component to it, it's because all the parties are focused on where we're trying to gain this. And the technology is just the way to support achieving it well and achieving it fast, but it's a supportive function.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, my answer to what's different this time would probably be, we don't have a choice, right? I think, the industry will make its way through T+1, through some brute force and through some creative solutions like us and other vendors are bringing to the market. But T0, you can't do it on the existing plumbing. It's not going to happen. So I think it's now just an imperative of people. And I think everybody's realizing that, and they're trying to rally around it. It's a call to action, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's a perfect arc in itself in terms of looping back to the beginning of the conversation, where we really said, that this is basically, we're running out of road here in terms of the operating models that we built and propagated in the 80s, 90s, that we need new answers. And ultimately, we've got $100 million worth answer here on the sec lending side, but also that probably in plus on the collateral side as well, as it folds out, as you said, into things we haven't even begun to imagine yet. But I think for me, what's so exciting about this space is basically that it's real. That we're seeing turnover, we're seeing participants, we're seeing projects actually really kick in now. So there's no question, as you said, that this is a moving train, and that basically that next year the list of credentials in terms of volumes, in terms of ideas, benefits, that $100 million will start to be realized very soon. So that's a great roundup, I think. And so thank you so much for a really, really fantastic conversation. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you very much.
And I'm sure if anyone's got any questions, they can reach straight out to you and start getting on with their own $100 million savings.
There you go. Thanks for doing this, Barnaby, and Kelly, thanks for joining.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. It was nice to see you.
Cheers.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the VX Insight podcast series. If you'd like more information and if you'd like to look at the numbers behind tokenization fact sheet, please visit thevalueexchange.co or reach out to us if you'd like to chat more. Thank you and have a good day.